I'm in a group of pastors, and there are 7 of us. We call ourselves the 7 Dwarfs. And we have been meeting recently to, in our way, come up with new ideas for our denomination. Our assessment, frankly, is that our Presbyterian Church in its present form is dying. And certainly the numbers financially and numerically, and we believe even theologically that it is dying. Somebody needs to come up with some new ideas so we can move forward and live. And so we've been meeting over the past year from across the country. We fly together, we talk, we pray together, we stand in front of a whiteboard and draw diagrams and things like that. And last November, we thought, we really need to talk to our denominational leaders in Louisville, Kentucky at headquarters and get some of their thoughts and let them know what we're thinking and this sort of thing. And so 4 of the 7 of us flew to Louisville, and we met with our stated clerk, Grady Parsons, and our executive director, Linda Valentine, some other leaders there. We were stunned. It could not have gone better. We were instantly on the same wavelength talking with these denominational leaders. We met for 6.5 hours over 2 days. And at the end of it all, they wound up coaching us on who to talk to next and how to strategically move forward in all this. And we were so thankful for that. And so the 4 of us who were there said goodbye to our colleagues. And then we stepped out that day into a cold, drizzly Louisville, Kentucky afternoon. And we took our coats and put them over our heads, and we kind of rushed across the street into the parking garage across the street. And we walked in there only to remember that none of us had remembered to remember where we had parked. As a matter of fact, we could not remember what our car looked like. It was one of those rental cars, with one of those bland sedans. And so here 4 of the pastors of the largest churches in our denomination running through the parking garage, trying to find this lost car. And the guy who rented the car was running with his key fob up in the air like this, trying to set off the panic button for the car, and we couldn't find it. Finally, one guy said, "Wait, I think we parked next to a pole." A pole. So we went running around looking for cars that were next to a pole and still couldn't find it. I won't tell you the names of the other 3 because I want to protect their identity. We found the car finally. We got in the car, and then it went from bad to worse because then we had to find the down ramp to get out of the parking garage. We were on the 2nd floor. We looked over. Yep, we got to go down. Okay. 4 leaders in the car meant 4 hands pointing different directions on how we should drive. And finally, after 3 times around the parking garage, we ended up finding our way to get down and out of there. And it suddenly dawned on us that if our denomination is depending on us for leadership, we're doomed. It is no hope whatsoever. Jesus often pointed out the lostness of religious people, and especially religious leaders who are often the most lost of all. And he created this unforgettable portrait of religious lostness in the face of the elder brother in the parable we call the parable of the prodigal son. Over the years, this parable has been kind of evolving in my mind. When I was in my 20s and 30s, it was all about that far country, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and this boy who just left it all there and then had to crawl home to his daddy, and then there was a big party. And I would stop there. In effect, I would preach half the parable and then just stop. Oh, yes, there was this older brother who was kind of a whiner, and he stood in the background and, was a party pooper in the midst of all the good things going on. But recently, as Mark mentioned a moment ago, I have found a book that absolutely has changed forever how I read the parable of the prodigal son. First of all, Timothy Keller, the author of the book, says delete the phrase parable of the prodigal son. Jesus begins the story by saying there was a man who had 2 sons. It's a story of 2 lost sons. And very often when we have a piece of writing that we have heard so many times, as we read it, our minds just jump ahead. Try to experience in real time the unfolding of this story as we look at it right now. It's in Luke chapter 15, and we're going to look at verses 1 and 2, and then we're going to skip down to verse 11, and we're going to follow it straight through. And we're going to look at these words of Jesus, but we're going to set the context first in verses 1 and 2. And this is the audience to whom Jesus is speaking. So we begin with verse 1 and 2 of Luke 15. We read, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" So you have the sinners and the tax collectors, then you have the Pharisees. And in response to this comment, Jesus now tells three stories, one of which is about a lost coin, another a lost sheep, and this third is the story of two lost boys. And now begin with verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So the father divided his property between those two boys. Not long thereafter, the young son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living." And wild living sort of conjures up all kinds of things. "After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older brother was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad because your brother of yours, who was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" And then it just ends. Two kinds of people clustered around Jesus, and each of those kinds of people see themselves mirrored in these two sons. First, there were the tax collectors and sinners, and they were the hardy party animals. They tromped on the boundaries of traditional morality and ceremonial law. And these tax collectors, these prostitutes, they were the ones who left home. And then we see the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who stayed home and stayed within the bounds of morality and that they would have been taught. And they were the Sabbath go-to-meeting people. The eye-opener is how each of them react and relate to Jesus. Verse 1 says the tax collectors were all gathering. That's the imperfect tense, and it talks about continuous action. In other words, from Jesus' very beginning of his ministry, he was always drawing to himself, like bugs to a floodlight, those younger brother types in society. And that upset the Pharisees. They said, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And in that day, to sit down and eat was code for to endorse and celebrate another person. And so what the religious leaders were saying is these people who never show up in church and worship are the ones who feel endorsed by Jesus. And obviously, he must be telling them what they want to hear. And so to show the Pharisees their narrowness and their blindness, Jesus now tells the story of not one, but two lost brothers. Of course, the younger son is lost, and we're going to talk next week about the younger son's lostness. But then, friends, there is a subtle and perhaps even more insidious and destructive kind of lostness that we're going to look at this morning, and that is the lostness of the elder brother. There's the obvious irreligious lostness, and there is the not so obvious religious lostness. And whether it's by DNA or whether it's by background, whether it's nature or nurture, I mean, sometimes kids are just born the way they are. Each of us have a tendency to come to God as either a younger brother or as an older brother. Older brothers, not surprise, surprise, often are elder siblings, because when you were born first, you relate naturally to the parents in the family, and older siblings tend to be more conservative and more traditional. And younger siblings often are kind of more freewheeling and they kind of paint outside the lines. But I want to say here is that we see the same thing writ large in society, and I'm going to take some big risks, and please forgive me if this doesn't seem like it fits with you, but think about this for a minute. Fox News, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, elder brother. MTV, younger brother. And MTV's going farther into the far country of late, I understand. Or Hollywood, the music industry, younger brother. The Tea Party movement, probably elder brother. Our elder sister, Sarah Palin. Younger sister, Lady Gaga. Older brother, work within the system, play by the rules. Just keep on working, stay on that path, and eventually it's going to pay off for you. Younger brother, be yourself, express what's going on inside of you, follow your bliss. Hey, don't let anything ever stand in the way of expressing your uniqueness. And some people say, well, we certainly know which way was the Jesus way, but Jesus here is saying, neither of those is my way. Both of those are paths down a dead end. And for us as Christians, I think that has to be a scary thing for us to think about. Think, for example, for a moment, Saturday night, you were feeling kind of frisky and alternative, and you decided to go out on the town last night, and you wound up in some very obvious younger brother venues last night. I won't tell, but just suppose, for example, that you were down in Little Five Points last night, and you're walking along the sidewalk through all those billows of funny-smelling smoke, and you're walking through all that, and you walk up to somebody and you say, hey, what time are you getting up for church tomorrow morning? You imagine how they'd look at you, at least most of them, and be like, what have you been smoking? Church, are you kidding? And yet, friends, those were the very people who rushed to Jesus. They were his key demographic. They were his base. And it was the Sunday go-to-meeting type people who were the ones who were so offended by Jesus that eventually they put him on a cross. And that has to deeply trouble us, I think, sometimes. In fact, at one point, Jesus even says to religious leaders, the prostitutes will go to heaven before you do. And yet, for most people today out there, Christianity is the face of the elder brother. It's very unsettling to contemplate this, but could it be that we're proclaiming a message that is different from the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world? Let's look for a moment at the rest of the story. Younger brother comes home, father accepts him, and then they throw a party. Okay. After that, now, older brother is out in the field and he is sweated through his clothing. He is working hard, and all of a sudden he hears very loud guitar licks coming from the big house, from big amps that are in there. He hears those guitars tuning up. And he sees cars converging around the big house. He thinks, what the is going on here? And he starts to run, and the servant meets him and says, your brother has come home. Your father has reinstated him as a son. This older brother is fit to be tied. First of all, there's the sheer cost of all of this. One of my favorite novels during the 1980s was a novel by Thomas Wolfe called The Bonfire of the Vanities about Wall Street in the 1980s. And he has this phrase he uses. He talks about hemorrhaging money. This whole story has been one long hemorrhaging of money up until now. There's been the selling of property, the liquidating of an estate, the blowing of an inheritance, and now they've just killed the prize cattle that they have there. They've raided the wine cellar. They're feeding half the county, and the older brother goes, whatever happened to fiscal responsibility? I mean, my dad has gone soft in the head. There is no respect for a work ethic around this place any longer. Look at me. I'm out here sweating through my clothes, and they're throwing the party for the wastrel in the family. And so he stands outside fuming. Meanwhile, what's taking place inside is the most important public event that father has ever put on. And now it is the older son's turn to disgrace his father. Because now he forces the dad to get up from the dais, the head table, where he's been up there toasting and hosting and all the rest. He has to turn and disappears, and the crowd turns and they all whisper to each other. There's something going on. You can imagine the conversation between father and son outside. Come on in, son. No way. Please, son, for me. There's not a chance. Son, you're ruining my big moment. This is really awkward. Won't you come? I don't care. The son says, I've been slaving for you. I have worked myself to the bone as a way of getting my hands on this inheritance. And now here you have taken the money that my younger brother has taken this money. He has never earned a penny of it. He's now gone and blown the family nest egg. He comes back. You reinstate him as an heir, so he's got a whole new claim on our wealth. Do you think I'm going to stand for this? Imagine the hurt to the father to know that the reason the elder son has stayed home really has been to get his inside track on the family inheritance. Father, with that power that he had in that day, could have disowned the son right on the spot. But you know what happens? This father humbles himself even further, symbolically getting on his knees, and he begs his son. He says, son, please take my arm. Let's walk in together to the feast. Let's be a family again. And then end of story. Roll the screen credits. Fade to black. That's the end of the story. And it's shocking. And you say, well, why isn't there some big Hollywood ending at the end of the story? And I'll tell you why. It's because Jesus is waiting for us to write the end of the story with our lives. He is saying to all the Pharisees of back then and the Pharisee in us this morning, won't you come in and sit down at the feast of my love? You see why this is such a shocker of a story. And that is because it's a story of two sons, both lost. And the bad son is the one who comes into the feast, and the good son's the one who stays out. The wild child gets saved, and the good boy is still lost. Can you imagine how it shocked the people that Jesus was speaking to? The fury of those Pharisees. Why doesn't the brother go in? And here was what we see revealed, and that is, in his soul, the elder brother is a carbon copy of the younger brother. He just uses a different tactic to get his hands on his father's money. In effect, what he says to this dad here is so painful. He says, Dad, let me just burst your bubble. This staying home and working with you has not been some kumbaya partnership, where we just love being together and I'm planting seed time and harvest and rotating crops and all that. I've been here because this is the best way I know to get my hands on what I've got coming to me. And that's it. In other words, this dad has two gold digger sons. And one of them, his tactic is to create a big scene and a power play, and he gets all the money and he goes away. The other one simply stays home and stays by the rules, works hard as his tactic to get what he wants. This poor dad has two sons, and neither of them love him truly for who he is. In her novel, Wise Blood, Flannery O'Connor says of a character, there was a deep black wordless conviction in him that the way to avoid Jesus was to avoid sin. Think about that. One way to avoid Jesus is to perform at such a high level you don't need a savior. In fact, why don't you try to get God to owe you instead of you owing God? I want to make this really simple little story. A week ago Friday, one of my daughters and her husband went out to a great steak eatery here in Atlanta. But they went out to dinner there and they went all out. They ordered the 24-ounce chef's cut bone-in ribeye steak. Each of them ordered this. And they just, all the trimmings. And needless to say, they got so full that they couldn't eat anymore. And they still took out a takeout bag, with what was left over. Next morning, they got up, they stayed at our house, and they decided that they were going to give their dog and my other daughter's dog the feast of their lifetime. And their dog, Milo, is a Brittany Spaniel. And my other daughter's dog, Riggs, is a cross between a French Bulldog and a Boston Terrier. We saw the parable of the two sons right there before us. They tossed this bone with all this meat falling off of it to the Brittany Spaniel, to Milo. And Milo fell to the ground and went to his happy place. He entered the feast right there on the spot. And we could hear him growling the Hallelujah chorus down there. He was just having the time of his life. Riggs, the terrier bulldog mix, was up on a hill, and they threw the bone to Riggs. Riggs did not look down. He did not look at the bone. He did not sniff the bone. He just stared at them. And he did this for about 2 minutes. And as looking at him, you suddenly began to see the wheels turning inside Riggs' head. And that was this: I did no act of obedience to earn this bone. And therefore, this is a trap. I will be poisoned if I eat this. Or more likely, if I take my eyes off you and I look down at this steak, you are going to converge on me and take me, throw me in a cage and take me down to the pound or something. You're not going to catch me. No way. And he continued to stare. And I'm not making this up. He actually moved sideways and started chewing on a threadbare old basketball, just doing like this, watching them. And so finally they ran up to give him the bone, and Riggs ran over, grabbed the bone, and ran it through the bushes. I'm going to tell you something. When God looks down at us, often he sees Riggs the dog. And he lays out for us the forever feast of his grace and his love, and it is full and free, and it's forever, and it's for every one of us. And we sit there and go, wait, I can't trust this. Grace is way too flimsy a foundation on which to build my life. I want to look at the end of my life, and I want to look over it, and I want to say, nobody handed it to me. I did it myself. And so, God, tell me some tricks to do for you, and then give me what I deserve, even if it's just chewing on some old mangled basketball. You see, there's a question that is often talked about in the church, and you may have heard it before, and that is, if you were to die tonight and you were to go to heaven, and you were to be asked at the gate of heaven why you should enter the presence of your Father, what would you say? And don't raise your hand, but would you say, well, because I have worked my entire life to be a really good person, and I have, if you look at the bell curve of the population, I'm going to be at least in the top 10 or 5% of goodness. I want to say to you as gently as possible, my friend, this morning, that is a form of lostness. That is elder brother lostness. That is Riggs the dog lostness. Do you ever get tired of trying to earn that which can only be received as a gift? This morning, the call for you and for me is to go on into the feast. You know, there's a place card at the head table, and it has your name on it, and it's right next to your father on one side. On the other side is your younger brother. This is a time for humility, for gratitude, and for joy. Yeah, go ahead and bite into the steak and be sure and say grace.